I'm Priscilla Jebaraj, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's edition of the Hindu's Parley podcast. The UK's Guardian newspaper announced earlier this month that it will no longer be posting on X, formerly known as Twitter, from any of its editorial handles. The Guardian said that the benefits of being on X are now outweighed by the negatives. It expressed concern about X's owner Elon Musk and the often disturbing content promoted or found on the platform, including far-right conspiracy theories and racism, and indicated that the US presidential election campaign was the last straw. The Guardian is not alone. Other journalists and news organizations are also abandoning the Twitter experiment for greener and hopefully cleaner fields. But this development also raises the broader question of whether social media itself is still a useful tool in building democratic societies, and what needs to be done to clean up the toxicity. Joining me today are Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect magazine, former editor-in-chief of The Guardian, and a member of Meta's Oversight Board, which makes content and policy recommendations for Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. And Prateek Sinha, co-founder and editor of Alt News, a fact-checking website which wades through much of the toxicity on Indian social media, debunking misinformation, verifying claims, and spotlighting hate speech. Let me start by citing The Guardian's concern that X is a toxic media platform and that its owner Elon Musk has been able to use its influence to shape political discourse. How much should a news outlet, or for that matter regular users, be worried about the ownership of a social media platform in deciding where we post and also where we consume news?
Well, it's a real dilemma because Twitter was, for many years, a really wonderful place for posting news and for finding audiences, for finding out news, and for building relationships. And so I can see a lot of news organizations, mine included, Prospect Magazine, have been debating whether to leave it. I think in normal circumstances, who owns a media platform shouldn't worry us too much. So lots of people are going to Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky now. I have no idea who owns Blue Sky, but it seems to be operating to high enough standards. But Elon Musk has so dominated Twitter, the platform that he bought, and insisted that people follow him, that it's difficult to ignore the question of ownership.
Prateek, what do you think?
We should be worried. The last few years that I've been working in the online space, what I've learned is that one should think of online spaces just the way we think of offline spaces. And that makes it easier to figure out what is correct and what is not. And in this particular case, in offline spaces, do we want to continue in toxic spaces? Usually we don't want to. Usually we try to quit toxic spaces. Some people have the privilege of quitting toxic spaces. For example, in relationships, when you're able to quit a toxic relationship, it typically is because you're financially independent and all of that. Sometimes you're not able to quit because you're not independent enough to quit a toxic space. So I look at the online space just like that in this particular case, Guardian is such a huge organization that even if they don't have Twitter traffic, it is okay with them. And it is not that other spaces are not toxic. It is not that Facebook is not toxic. It is not that YouTube is not toxic. X is probably just a little more toxic than other platforms. So it's a privilege that one is able to quit a more toxic platform and focus on other platforms. And I think it should be done just as in real life, if we are able to quit toxic spaces, even in our online lives, we should be quitting toxic spaces.
Yeah. And how about the ownership issue? How much do we note who owns, when we're talking offline, how much do we note who owns newspapers or, and should we?
We should, but at the same point in time, ownership is not the only issue, right? Like in Indian media, we have families have owned media organizations for a very long time. And now, the corporates are coming in the last decade or so. But it has clearly changed the dynamic of Indian media once the corporates came in. And of course, the politics of the country changed. So it is important to know who owns media organizations, but at the same point in time, it is not the only factor. One also has to look at day-to-day reportage, how things are being reported, I would say X would be the same. That is, had Elon Musk bought it and not use it as a political tool, then it would have been a different matter. But in this particular case, not only has he bought it, not only has he used it as a personal tool, not just a political tool. It was also like if you go on X, you always see his tweets because the algorithm has tweaked to ensure that no one on X not everyone has to see his tweets. So it's also a tool for personal marketing and political marketing. So so that is where the problem is.
So, as a digital news veteran, how important is social media in disseminating your content? I mean, who has the privilege to make those choices? And what do you think of legacy media's attempts to get their content on social media? How critical is social media to disseminating content?
Social media is very important, unfortunately. Social media is a walled garden. All these platforms are walled gardens, and it is really unfortunate for all of humanity that our primary sources of information have become these social media platforms, which in turn are controlled by these multi-billion dollar companies. They are controlled by these. Two of them are monopolies, and one of them is being run by a madman. So that is our sort of misfortune, that all of humanity is getting information from these 3-4 platforms. And now what choice do we have? It is like, if a economy allows monopolies to exist and prosper, then just like in a few years, all of us will just be using Geo because everyone else will not be able to survive. Or in a few years, all of us, we are already flying only Indigo. So then you don't have choices. And in case of social media, we don't have choices. We have to use these platforms because how else we reach out to people? And that also makes censorship so easy because the government only has to go to these 2-3 platforms, only has to have a relationship with these 2-3 platforms, the kind of relationships that governments typically have with monopolies, to ensure that the information that should reach citizens is not reaching, that it is censored. So we are, as far as our world of information is concerned, we are in a very, very tricky space because we really have no free platforms where information can reach citizens without many, many layers of filters.
Alan, what's your take on that?
Well, it used to be really important. I mean, there are about 350 million people on Twitter, so it's by no means the largest platform, but it's a considerable audience. And in the digital world, for a long time, it was really important to be able to amplify your journalism through that platform. I think it's become less and less important. People who analyze these things say that the number of referrals from search engines, from social media, and to some extent from search engines has gone down. And of course, that might get worse with AI.
So are some platforms worse than others? What alternatives do you think are doing a better job? You mentioned Blue Sky. There was a rush to Mastodon at one point. I think another kind of audience has moved to Threads.
Well, I think the problem with Musk is that there's a huge mismatch between the editorial standards and values that the best news organizations represent and the editorial standards of Musk. He has none. He's abandoned all the trust and safety teams. He doesn't really believe in any form of content moderation. He sees it as censorship. And the attempts by regulators and advertisers to try and moderate and clean Twitter up have been met with the most foul-mouthed rejection. And he has a contempt for the free press, is the other thing. He loathes legacy media, and he's constantly telling people that they shouldn't believe anything on legacy media, and that the only place you can find the truth nowadays is X. And so it's an act of peculiar masochism to keep appearing on his platform when he despises us. So I think that's why people are thinking, well, let's go somewhere where we're valued and where the concept of facts and truth and journalism still count for something.
What alternatives do you think are better? And what kind of checks should social media platforms put in place to reduce such toxicity. You're on Meta's oversight board. What checks do you advise? And what are the alternatives which are doing a good job?
So there are three main alternatives. There's Mastodon, which I think everyone found extremely hard to use and it has not really worked. There's Threads, which is the Facebook alternative, which has become really quite popular quite quickly. And then there's something called Blue Sky, which I see a lot of journalists now fleeing to.
Right.
I think the question is, there is a view that you shouldn't moderate anything. That is not a view that has that has widely bought favor in the world, apart from America under Donald Trump, if I can put it like that. So I think most people feel that there is a lot of illegal, harmful content which should be moderated in some way. The difficulty for these platforms now is that the signs are that Trump and Musk and the people around them don't believe in moderation. They just believe in unfettered free speech. They believe in the right to shout fire in a crowded theatre. And I think those of us who don't believe in completely unqualified free speech are going to find that problematic.
Prateek, what do you think?
So, firstly, the question about alternatives. What should be considered an alternative? That is the first question. The problem right now is centralization of information. So anything that is decentralized in nature, so Mastodon is decentralized in nature, Blue Sky has been designed to be decentralized in nature, where one can host their own pods, one can host their own instances. And that is how communication should be. If you look back at, let's say, email, again, when Gmail was not a monopoly, and email was this beautiful medium where one could host their own email. Every organization had their own email system, and we were communicating with each other perfectly. There is no glitch in the protocol. That is, someone sends an email from Hindu to Alt News, and Alt News sends an email from Alt News to some other organization. The way email is designed, it is quite a cool decentralized system, and which means that let's say tomorrow Gmail brings the emails down, then Hindu's emails still keep running and Alt News emails still keep running. That is how communication systems should be designed. So what I consider as true alternatives to the present are the decentralized systems. Threads, for example, I don't consider as an alternative because it is just another product by a monopoly which is not decentralized. Though Threads is attempting to include some decentralization features, they are compatible with one specific protocol which Mastodon also uses. So Thread has some movements towards that, but I wouldn't consider it as an alternative. But we all should consider alternatives, and alternatives will not be as convenient to use, and we should be okay with that inconvenience, because it is only that way that these platforms will have the opportunity to improve. I think misinformation is kind of platform agnostic. Quantitatively, it is very difficult to say whether there's more on one, because it also depends on usage. For example, in India, there's more misinformation on WhatsApp, but that is the way misinformation should be looked at is number of instances of misinformation and their repetition. So in WhatsApp, it is the same misinformation that ends up in all our inboxes. It is not that it is a unique piece of misinformation which does not exist on Twitter or Facebook. It exists on all platforms, but it's just that the usage of WhatsApp is high in India. So as far as misinformation is concerned, it is largely platform agnostic. What is different, probably, is the amount of hate speech that is being put out on different platforms, because hate speech has most all platforms have a policy vis-a-vis hate speech. The question is whether those policies are being implemented or not. And let's say in case of X, they're not being implemented at all. In case of X in India, I don't think there's a single Twitter employee dedicated to moderating Indian content. Everyone was fired. I don't know if new people have been hired. So maybe in that particular case, Facebook might be slightly better than X because there are people moderating content there.
So what kind of checks do you think social media platforms should be putting in place to reduce such toxicity, assuming they want to?
There are many checks that are needed. I have stopped believing that they are willing to do that. that belief has been shattered a long, long time ago. Yeah, they are not willing. They're absolutely not willing. For example, it is not, it is not very, very difficult. Like you need to invest money in humans to moderate content. That is the first thing. Now, if you look at certain African countries, Asian countries, for example, when riots had happened in Sri Lanka, Facebook did not have a single moderator sitting in Sri Lanka. There were few moderators sitting in an office in Hyderabad. When the whole Rohingya exodus happened, there was no one monitoring, there was no moderator in a local language. India, if you look at number of moderators per million of population, India would be one of the lowest in the world. If you look at the language models, the amount of money that they have invested in language models for automated hate detection, India becomes a very complicated country when it comes to automated hate detection, because there's so many languages, so much nuance. Dog whistling is different in every language, and none of these platforms are able to do that because they don't want to invest the money, and the governments of our countries are not interested either in ensuring that these platforms are accountable. So I really don't think that the present platforms have any interest in doing anything. Their only concern is increasing screen time, increasing profit. Every year they have to report back to the shareholders that, oh, we have made more money than last year. And platforms that are not selling any products, then they are only ensuring they're only based on advertisements. Then the only way they can do that, especially in case of digital, is that you watch them more and more. That is, you're spending more and more time on the phone screens. So I really don't think that they can do anything to change this, and we really should consider alternatives.
Alan, what's your take on that?
I think the best platforms are developing systems, and it's bound to involve a lot of AI to try and identify people who are trying to cause real harm. I mean, during the recent Southport riots in England, Elon Musk himself was retweeting really dangerous stuff. There were people using Twitter to say these were Muslims. They were trying to find the places where they were staying to burn them down. Now you can't have, I don't think, social media being used to organize murder. That's that should be obvious. And so whether it's human fact checkers or AI systems or human moderators or AI content management moderation systems, I think most people think that you've got to have some systems to catch the worst behavior, because otherwise you have this technology which can be used to cause immense harm.
So back, over a decade ago, in the wake of during the Arab Spring, social media was hailed as some sort of savior of democracy. Clearly, that was premature. But also, even during a few years ago, when the farmers' protests were outside Delhi, similarly, they did harness the power of social media to a certain extent, both to spread their message as well as to mobilize people. What role do you think social media can and does play in building up democracy in India or in other parts of the world? In what way can it be beneficial to?
I feel that we sort of confuse between a communication system and a communication system controlled by monopolies. Any communication system which works well is great for citizens and great for democracy. And any communication system that exists will be used by people to put their voice out, whether it is a farmers' protest, even, for example, the present genocide of Israel and Gaza. There we know what is happening in Palestine because it is being broadcasted. The number of people who died in Iraq, for example, if I was looking at the statistics, and that is much, much more than the number of people who have died in Palestine at this point in time. But in Iraq happened when there was no social media, so we didn't know how horrific that war was. So any communication system is necessary to ensure that the atrocities get relayed, that human rights abuses get relayed, and is always good for democracy. But when that same communication system becomes part of the system that is committing the atrocity, when it is subsumed by the system that is committing the atrocity, then it becomes part of that system. So it is we have to realize that while social media has to be social. We have taken the social out of social media. And so, a true communication system where people are able to express, etc., is always going to be extremely empowering for democracies.
Well, social media at its best is marvelous. I mean, the thought that for 2 millennia, most people had no way of reaching an audience. And now on a platform like Facebook, there are, I think, still 3 billion people who have the ability to publish and to connect with each other. And a lot of that activity is harmless to good. They're using it to good purposes to organize or innocent purposes. So it would be terrible to blacken all social media and to say, look, this huge experiment that is really only 20 years old should be abandoned or clamped down on. But I think it's possible to stamp out the dangerous and malign way of using social media from the people who are just there and rejoice in the ability to speak to each other.
And given these new abilities, what is it that news organizations can do apart from spreading information? Are there other ways that news organizations can work to harness the power of social media to benefit democracy? How should we be changing what we do?
Well, I think in the end, I think a lot of news organizations will leave Twitter because it's become a very murky space, and it's really
Right.
the good things about converging and discussing and amplifying voices, all those things become very difficult. So I think, start by choosing a platform which is run on ethical lines. And then I think we need to start again and try and recreate the kind of reasonably civilized discourse, which I think actually was good for journalism. I think it was good for journalism to be challenged by readers and to, the best journalists I know were using Twitter in an amazingly innovative way to find stories, to find sources, to cultivate contacts. So, for
I think even more than spreading news, it was to get news.
Absolutely. And that was, for a while it was exhilarating. But that ended almost overnight, the moment that Elon Musk moved in with a very different idea of what Twitter should be.
So you're looking at a clean slate. That seems optimistic. A second chance?
Yeah, a second chance. Well, from what I've seen so far of Blue Sky, people are rejoicing in the fact that it feels purer. You're breathing a purer air, and let's hope that it stays that way.
Sorry, something just occurred to me, playing devil's advocate maybe for a minute. Pratik, you mentioned the value of decentralization, and I get that, so that there's not one player controlling everything. But don't you think that also tends to, move us off into these little boxes where each of us now gets our information from a different group? So I never hear whereas back in the days of when you had one Doordarshan news broadcast or, the newspaper turning up once a day, largely everybody saw the same thing. You at least had a shared ownership of facts, whatever you thought of in terms of opinion. Whereas now it's like we each get our facts also from different sources and different facts. With social media, isn't that easier to do?
No, actually, we should be getting our information from different sources, and we should have the education of knowing how to deal with facts. To live in a world of information, you have to know how to deal with the world of information. You have to have media and information literacy classes in schools where children know how to look at different sources and how to process them. But limiting information to one centrally controlled source is always dangerous. It has to, there has to be decentralized, and the power of decentralization is that you also can choose who not to communicate with. So basically, these are different pods. And let's say one pod is this extremely toxic space, then you can choose not to communicate with that pod, and that way you safeguard the mental health, etc., of people who are in the other pod. So it is important that communication gets decentralized. It is difficult to imagine at this point of time because historically we almost have had centralized communication systems, but If we start thinking about decentralized communication systems, then we will see the benefits. Yes, of course, there will always be challenges, but those are not unsurmountable.
Thank you so much. This was really enlightening. Thank you.